of a story that I just wrote. Within the past 2 months anyway. I've done a batch of, I've done 2 anthologies that are essentially art-based. One is In Sunlight or in Shadow, which is stories inspired by paintings of Edward Hopper. And the second is Alive in Shape and Color, which is stories inspired by a variety of paintings. And I've got a third coming out, sometime next year, I think in the fall, about a year from now, called From Sea to Stormy Sea, and it's again, stories inspired by paintings, but these are all the work of American artists. And I wasn't going to write a story for this anthology. And then somebody was unable to deliver. And I thought, who am I going to get to fill in? Because I wanted a certain number of stories. And I thought, oh, come on, it's your turn in the barrel. So, here we are. And it's called The Way We See the World. I see they spelled his name right, or at least they spelled it the way he spelled it, Lichthenstein, but you could argue that that was a mistake on his part, or that of his parents, or some factotum at Ellis Island. The painting in front of her was indeed by Roy Lichtenstein, part of a show that Whitney had chosen to call The Way We See the World. And the man who'd just spoken to her was standing a little behind her and a little to her left. If she'd been driving a car, he'd be in her blind spot. Was he someone she knew? She didn't recognize the voice, and something kept her from turning to see if the face was familiar. He'd spoken with such casual assurance that one would think he knew her, or at least that he thought he knew her, but without looking, she somehow decided that this was not the case, that he didn't know her at all. That the intimation of familiarity, the casual assurance, might in fact be the point. One has to assume, he went on, that the family name derives from the country, the Grand Duchy of Liechtenstein, but that's spelled with an E. Well, several E's actually, but the country begins Liecht, and the artist's name, as you can see, does not. It struck her that the two of them might have been in a painting, a woman looking at something, a man behind her and to one side, invisible to her, but not to the viewer, who could see them both and would know what he looked like. There was a particular painting that came to mind, and she could see it now in her mind's eye, but couldn't summon up the name of the artist. She remembered the man in the painting, his features ill-defined, his eyes peering out beneath a cloth cap. And she could imagine the man behind her, but what did he look like? She still did not turn toward him, but was unable to keep from glancing at the painting's label and confirming the spelling of the name. He wouldn't let it go at that, she knew. He'd say something else, and she'd have to turn then and find some remark, polite but uncompromising, to turn him away. She'd lived long enough to have developed the requisite coping mechanisms, and she could surely make it clear to him that they were not going to have a conversation about this painting or the man who'd painted it or anything else. She waited, sifting phrases in her mind, and he didn't say a word. He hadn't moved, she could sense his presence, but he'd answered her silence with silence of his own, and now she felt somehow off balance. There was a word for it, a term from the world of chess. Her ex-husband had a half-serious interest in the game, and she'd learned the word from him. But had evidently not learned it terribly well, she thought, because she couldn't recall it now. It was German, or at least it sounded German, and what it meant was that it was your turn to move, but that no move you could make would be advantageous. Remarkable, really, that the Germans could get all of that into a single word. So it was her turn to move, and she couldn't find a move she liked, and she felt something and recognized it as anxiety. Low-level anxiety, nothing that would send a person on a hunt for the Xanax bottle, but still. But you don't really need the label, do you? The Ben-Day dots, the comic book imagery. It's unmistakably the work of this painter and no other. That may be why I like it. She turned. To see a man looking not at her, but at the painting. He was a couple of inches taller than she, and perhaps as many years older. Clean-shaven, dark hair, strong features, jeans, a blue button-down shirt, a tie, a blazer that might have started out as the jacket of a dark pinstripe suit. Zugzwang, that was the German word, the compulsion to move. She said, "You like the painting because of the dots?" And now he turned to her, and his face seemed to light up at the sight of her. "Not the dots," he said, "although it would be hard to imagine the painting without them. But what predisposes me to like the work is that it's so instantly recognizable as the artist's work. A single glance and one says to oneself, 'Ah, of course, Roy Lichtenstein.'" His shoes were Cordovan slip-ons. His tie bore red and blue diagonal stripes. He wore eyeglasses, but would probably have looked as studious without them. He was not wearing a wedding ring. "I think," he said, "that part of my favorable response to the painting is a matter of ego. I congratulate myself for being immediately able to name the artist, even as I respectfully acknowledge him for the individuality of his work. Good on you, Roy, with your Ben-Day dots." "And good on you," she said, "with your eagle eye. Do you have other favorites?" "Oh, yes," he said, and paused to consider the question. "Very different artists in the main, and it's something else that gets me. Not dots. And not the recognition factor either, if we may call it that. There are some paintings, some painters, that achieve their effect on a more primal level. Unless it's a work I've seen before, I can't look at something by Rembrandt or Picasso or Vermeer or Albert Bierstadt and know for certain whose work I'm seeing. All I necessarily know is that what's in front of me is magnificent, that it touches me." She hadn't expected to get drawn into conversation, and caught up in it in the bargain. "Once in London," he said, "I was in either the National Gallery or the National Portrait Gallery, and I found myself in front of one of Rembrandt's self-portraits, and I could only stand there and look at it." They weren't in a painting, she thought. They were in a story, reciting the dialogue someone had written for them. She recalled that Rembrandt was said to have painted 170 oils, of which 200 are in European galleries, she said, and 300 in the United States of America. I may have the numbers wrong. I'd say you're close enough. Close enough, she thought, so that either of them could reach out and touch the other. But if someone had in fact written that line of dialogue for her, she'd let it remain unspoken. Internal monologue was where it belonged, if it belonged anywhere. "Now with Rothko," he said, "there's never any question. It's his work and nobody else's." She'd been looking at a Rothko just minutes ago. Had he been observing her? At her elbow, perhaps? Or perhaps not. That was the way the gallery traffic was flowing. One looked at the Rothko, one moved on to the Lichtenstein. "I suppose one could forge a Rothko," she said, "although it would be difficult." A sufficiently skilled forger could imitate anyone, although some would be easier than others. There was one fellow they caught a while ago who never copied existing works. He'd paint in the style of Gauguin or Corot or Monet. His defense was that he wasn't forging anything, he was making new paintings. Imitating rather than forging, she said. Did the argument get him acquitted? No, but it was an interesting contention. He'd misrepresented the work to buyers and was accordingly convicted of fraud. But were the paintings themselves forgeries? She recalled a remark of some renowned wit of the last century. Imitation is the sincerest form of plagiarism. She might have said it aloud if she had remembered who said it. Jackson Pollock would be interesting, he said. As instantly identifiable as Lichtenstein or Rothko, but an actual line-for-line copy would be out of the question. You couldn't possibly do it. On the other hand, you could do your own drip painting in the manner of Pollock. Exactly, he said, though it would almost certainly be more difficult than it looks. Easy enough to splash the paint around, but hard to make it look right. Like so many things, she thought. Mondrian, he said, anybody can imitate him and everybody does, on highball glasses and t-shirts and shower curtains and God knows what else. Surgical masks? I like his paintings, she said. Yes, so do I, and not just because I can recognize them. Wasn't he Dutch, or was it Belgian? Dutch, he said. So what's he doing in the Whitney? Don't they limit themselves to American artists? He came here during the war. To America? To Manhattan, he said. Lived here for 4 or 5 years until his death. Spent his days painting and his nights at the jazz joints on 52nd Street. Broadway boogie-woogie, she said. Of course, New York and jazz on the same canvas. But that's at MoMA. I don't know if I've seen this one. His work evolved, he said, but certain constants never changed. Primary colors and right angles. It was more than a style for him, it was an article of faith. There was a fellow countryman, Theo van Doesburg, and they were great good friends and both painted the same rectilinear abstracts. And then Van Doesburg started painting diagonal lines, and Mondrian wouldn't speak to him for years. Seriously? Well, accounts differ, but it's a hell of an offense. I mean, sleeping with a man's wife is one thing, but painting diagonal lines, unforgivable, evidently. Not a painting. A short story, spare in prose and rich in dialogue. A story that held you in a loose grip. You can't stop reading because you need to know how it comes out, but you proceed with caution because you're afraid you won't like the ending. They moved as one from painting to painting. A few he studied in thoughtful silence, but more often than not he had something to say about a painting or an artist. He didn't lecture. It didn't feel as though he was mansplaining the show to her, but there were things he knew and views he held, and she found herself engaged. And there were things she knew that he didn't. Hedda Stern, for instance. They both responded strongly to the abstract expressionist painting, dark in color and mood, and he leaned in to read the label. Hedda Stern, 1910 to 2011. If those dates are right, she had a long run. They're right, she said. She lived 100 years and was still painting well into her 80s. Born in Romania, she told him. Her first husband was named Stern, and she followed him to New York when war broke out. They changed Stern to Stafford, but when she showed her work, she became Stern again, but added an E to it. She kept the name, she said, but ditched the man and married Saul Steinberg. She found a few more facts to spout, then explained she'd read Stern's obituary in the Times and found herself moved to surf the internet for more information. I may have been looking for the secret of her long life, she said. If she had one, she kept it to herself. He nodded and gave Stern's painting another long look. A story, as she'd heard, required a beginning and a middle and an ending. Theirs had been fitted out with a decent beginning, catching one's attention, drawing one in. But she sensed that the beginning was winding down. Even as she had the thought, he glanced at his watch. 2:30, he reported. Do you like the cafe downstairs? It's the middle of the week, and what lunch crowd they might draw will have thinned by now. Would you like tea or coffee? Or a glass of wine? Ah, the end of the beginning, easing its way into the beginning of the middle. She breathed in, she breathed out. She said, why not?
Another round for that.
All right. I mean, we've done a lot of these. I think this was one of the best.
This was
Just
a terrific one.
everyone brought their A game, and it was a really great collection of authors.
Great
So-
variety as always.
Yeah. So thanks to the authors, the readers, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the bookstore, and hang out, buy some books.
Yeah.
It's for a great cause. If you don't pick up a book tonight, the GoFundMe page for Team Evie is on the event page,
Right.
or just do a search on GoFundMe for Team.
That's
Evie.
gonna be up as far as we know.
Yeah, that'll be up,
For
and
all that.
it's just whatever you can do to help them out. They're going through a very
Yeah.
difficult, terrible time, and if we can lift
Help
their
out in
spirit,
any way,
help out in
their
any
spirits,
way,
that's right,
it would be amazing. So thanks to everyone.
Yeah, one other suggestion is that one way to help them out would be to buy something of Dwayne's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and he has some great work in print, and go for it.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks everyone. And if you want a reader, come up. We'll take a
Thank you
photo.
for all that.